Hey guys, Savage Warrior here, bringing you some Boom Beach and continuing on with the Zuka training series and discussing today the secondary flare, or what I would like to call the distant javelin throw. Here we're going to be focused on a critical skill of throwing that distant flare. This requires timing, precision, quick screen navigation, and a bit of practice. Once you've learned how to land, then group and gather the Zookas. The next thing to do is hurling that flare like a javelin to the far off distance, which significantly determines the walking path. Simply put, Zookas walk from point A to point B in the straightest line as possible, and throwing that distant flare establishes a destination that will create an easy walking path for you to cover with smoke. There are several other skills that we still need to learn, but this is the next essential skill needed to understand before we can move forward. I really wanted to teach this because, in my opinion, this is one of the most exciting aspects of the game and the sole reason I work so hard to clear the map and earn those crystals and use power powder to boost my attacks. So let's review our last video on Zuka landings. Here we learned how to land without the flare to avoid one of the most common mistakes for beginners, and using a nearby structure to group and gather the Zookas. Secondly, we learned how to land with the flare when there are no nearby structures, and use the flare to group and gather, then using a secondary flare to narrow the walking path toward your desired target. As mentioned before, this is one of the most common Zuka landings in task force operations. Finally, I showed you my favorite Zuka landing, the Smoky Beach Run. This is when you flare to the corner and smoke as you deploy the landing crafts. This is the most effective way to quickly group and gather in dangerous situations when defensive structures are on the beach. If you master this skill, you'll be able to climb walls like a pro. So let's look how effective this beach run can actually be. But in this case, we do not need to smoke, making this a stress-free landing as long as we give ourselves enough space to land. We want to first get our troops in a corner and lay down our first smoke. But during the whole time, we are focused on that javelin throw of flaring to the exact spot where we want to tap the screen and establish a straight walking line. Please notice how close the flare is to the wall. If this flare is just a tiny bit too much to the right, some of your Zookas will veer and drift off on their own path, and I guarantee will die and decrease the amount of damage you can do to the core. Missing the right place to flare can really mess up your attack. A little warning here, I don't know exactly what happened after the previous update, and I'm not talking about the most recent one, but many of you have noticed that if you try to tap too high on the phone, for some reason the game doesn't respond to your tap. Even after the new update, this hasn't improved, and I recommend knowing in advance where you want to throw that distant flare and move your screen far enough to the top so that you can quickly put your Zookas back into view. I'm going to try to illustrate this in the next clip. Doing a Smoky Beach run really works well when you need to throw a distant flare. With rocket launchers on the beach, I'm doing a 2-smoke landing because in this base, known as Complex, it requires a huge amount of gunboat energy. Notice you have to quickly flare to the top of the screen, and you really need to be careful about that dead space because it won't respond to the flare. Let me try to illustrate how to work around this problem with a live clip. I first lay down a smoke and start to deploy my Zookas one by one. But I want you to notice after I hit my second smoke how quickly I tap back onto the Zuka icon. Then, lying down a lead smoke, I immediately move my screen to find a target and throw my flare. Sometimes you have to just trust that you're going to hit your mark. You need to move your screen back to the Zookas because they're now going to respond to that distant flare you threw, and you may want to even zoom in that area so that you can carefully anticipate the movement of the troops as they will weave through the defensive structures. Now we throw a second flare, but it's not as far and you won't need to move your screen. Just remember, this location is in one of the most notorious locations in the upper left-hand corner of your screen where there seems to be a dead space. It's very simple to overcome as long as you keep this in mind. I really think this is one of the best tips you should remember in this video. The next space I'm going to show you might be the longest javelin throw in the game. In long distance flares, you have to master landing Zookas in order to be confident enough to move your screen to locate where to hit. On this base, you must hit to the top corner exactly because it's a long walk through many defensive structures that are deliberately offset. This long walk requires many smokes, will cost you a ton of gunboat energy, and you need to predict how Zookas walk around defensive structures well enough in advance to prepare yourself for the next flare in the corner. Hitting the same location will ensure your troops continue in the straightest line possible, and it becomes difficult to space your smokes through these cannons because it's kind of hard to see. Each smoke you lay down now are really expensive, so there's really no room for error. Remember, we still need enough gunboat energy for 3 shocks and possibly some critters. So today we focused on the distant flare called what I'm calling the Javelin throw. You might want to go back to the previous video on landing because you really need to master this skill before you can move forward. I hope you enjoy this video, and until next time, Savage Warrior out.